The number has stopped rolling, so I'm going to just start with our introductions and maybe people can come in. So hello everyone. If I haven't met you, my name is Wendy Craig and I'm the Scientific Director of PREVNet. And on behalf of our whole team today, I'd like to welcome you to our seminar, which I'm very excited about. Before we start, I'd just like to ask that each of you, wherever you're located today, please take a moment and join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous people who have cared for these lands and in celebrating the continued strength in the spirit of Indigenous peoples. Where I'm located, it's situated on the traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territories, and I'm a fourth generation immigrant settler to this land. And so I acknowledge that it's only through past and continued colonization that I've been able to learn, work, live, and play on these lands. I'm also committed to continuing to educate myself on Indigenous allyship and how best to support Indigenous people in my community. So please take a moment and acknowledge the lands that you're on. We're bringing today's webinar from the Community of Practice to address teen dating violence that's funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada. And I'm very excited that we have partnered today with Dr. Alexa Martin-Storey for her webinar titled Dating and Sexual Violence Among Gender and Sexual Minority Adolescents, What We Know and How We Can Help. But before I introduce her and give over the microphone and the camera, I'd like to go through our format for today's webinar. We've posted a link to the slides in the chat box in English and French. And so you can print a copy, you can follow along, you can make notes. The webinar will run for about 75 minutes. Alexa's going to talk for about 60 minutes, and then we're going to have about 15 minutes for questions. If you get a question that's coming to you as we go along, please put it in the chat box and we'll make sure that we get to it before the end. And then at the end of the webinar, we will put in a link to evaluate today's webinar. And we really find that these responses are really valuable and help us in our planning. All of your feedback is anonymous, so please take the 2 minutes to complete the survey. And then once you've completed the survey, you'll be directed to a website where you'll be prompted to enter your name and email address, and you'll get a certificate of attendance that will be automatically generated and emailed to you. And I just want to assure you that the evaluation and that certificate of attendance is completely separate, so that we have no way of connecting them. I also want to let you know that the webinar, that's a good thing I'm not doing the talking, the webinar is being recorded today. So we'll send out a link to everyone that's registered, so you can share that link to others, or if you want to watch it again because it's going to be so great, then feel free to share it so that we can share the knowledge and the learnings. So that's all of the administrative things, and so it's my great pleasure to introduce Alexa Martin-Storey. She is a Canada Research Chair in Stigma and Psychosocial Development at the University of Sherbrooke. She is fascinated by the ways in which youth, and particularly sexual and gender minority identities, survive and frequently thrive despite the obstacles that they experience. Her work focuses particularly on the social context, and she often examines how relationships within neighborhoods, peers, and romantic partners shape adolescents and their young adult outcomes. So I'm delighted to have her with us today, and I'm now going to turn the presentation over to her. So thank you again, and I look forward to learning and hearing about your great work.
So thank you very much, Wendy. That was a really nice introduction. Hello from Cupid's Newfoundland. So I'm way on the east of probably almost all of you today. Before I get started today, there's two things that I wanted to touch on very briefly. This is a webinar about dating and sexual violence, which is a difficult topic and often a potentially triggering topic for a lot of people. I will be talking about dating and sexual violence, but I'm not going to be presenting images or video relating to dating or sexual violence. And I also don't include things like people's descriptions of their experiences of dating or sexual violence, just to give you some idea of what you can expect. And I have resources at the end. Now, these are described as resources for youth and young people, but these resources in terms of dealing with these kinds of issues can frequently be used by people of any age. And then finally, the other thing that I wanted to mention is that I'm coming at this data today, and I'm mostly going to be talking about results that we have from a quantitative perspective. And most of these samples most of the kinds of things that I'm going to be talking about were studied with youth who ranged in terms of their race ethnicity. But I'm not going to be talking a lot specifically about the dating violence experiences of racialized youth. We can talk at the end a little bit about how sexual and gender minority racialized youth may face additional barriers, but I wanted to give you a heads up that I'm not going to be delving into those specific areas today, because that would really be a whole other very lengthy webinar. So in terms of getting started, I'm going to introduce some topics. I think talking about definitions, especially when we're talking about sexual and gender minority status, are really important. I'm then going to talk a little bit about the ecological context of sexual and gender minority youth. So this is going to give us some understanding of why we might be particularly interested in looking at sexual and dating violence within this population. We're then going to talk about romantic relationships during adolescence. And I think it's very important to talk about these relationships as both a context of resilience as well as a context for risk. We're going to talk more specifically then about sexual violence among sexual and gender minority youth. We're going to talk about barriers that these groups of youth have when it comes to help seeking. And then finally, I'm going to give some more specific recommendations for educators. So I use the term sexual minority. This is an umbrella term. So when we talk about this for adolescents, this includes individuals who have sexual identities other than heterosexual. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about different sexual identities in a minute. Individuals who report same-sex romantic or sexual attraction, or individuals who report same-sex romantic or sexual partners. And one of the reasons why I think that looking at dating violence within particularly sexual minority populations is so important is because who these youth want to have relationships with and what their romantic attractions are really are fundamental to them being sexual minorities. And while we might expect that these are going to be that youth would report a sexual minority identity and same-sex attraction or same and other sex attraction and same-sex sexual behavior, when we actually look at youth, we see a much more complicated and a much more dynamic situation. So it's actually a minority of youth who show consistency across all three of these dimensions. And the way that we don't think about youth who are more consistent as being more legitimate in terms of being sexual minorities. We understand that these are developmental processes that evolve over time and are based on sort of youth's experiences and opportunities. And when we think about what a sexual minority is, it's important to keep these dimensions in mind, especially when we talk about adolescents who may take some time to come to the identity labels or even their likelihood of engaging in romantic behavior. We often focus specifically on identity, and that's really for a practical reason, because in terms of thinking about gearing services towards individuals or developing interventions, it's going to be easier to talk to and identify the needs of adolescents who identify as sexual and gender minorities. And one of the things that's the most fun about working in this area is how youth are increasingly creative and increasingly precise with their identities. I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but one of the things that never ceases to amaze me is that every time I give a questionnaire to a bunch of adolescents, I learn new things about how adolescents are thinking about their identities. So we have the more traditional identities, so gay identities, lesbian identities, bisexual identities. We also have a bunch of newer identities. So these are queer and pansexual and mostly heterosexual identities. These tend to be identities in which individuals are more interested in sort of unpacking ideas around gender. There are also increasingly youth who use identities reflecting patterns of attraction. So youth who, rather than identifying as monogamous, identify as polyamorous or wanting to form various kinds of relationships with multiple people. And then we also have relationships that are related to lower levels or lower level of sexual attraction. So you have demisexual individuals, and then you have asexual individuals where the levels of either sexual or romantic attraction may or may not be something that they're interested in having in a relationship. There's also quite a number, and this is only scratching the surface of culturally specific identities. Two examples that you're going to come up with a lot in a Canadian context are allosexual identities. These are sort of queer identities, but specifically in the Quebec context. And then two-spirited identities. So this is a pan-Indigenous term that captures a broad range of sexual and gender identities among various First Nations and Inuit communities and within North America. More broadly, in terms of talking about these identities, we tend to classify identities as being either monosexual, so that would be heterosexual identities, gay identities, lesbian identities, where someone is attracted just to men or just to women, versus bisexual identities, where individuals report attraction to two or more genders. The next thing I'm going to talk a little bit about is gender identity. So when we talk about sex, that's the individual's biological attributes that include a complex range of things, including chromosomes, gene expression, hormone level, and hormone function. It's a really biological term. And then we also have gender identity, which is the way an individual perceives themselves and expresses their characteristics related to being a man, a woman, or a gender diverse person. I'm going to use the term cisgender sometime in this presentation. And that's individuals for whom sex and gender identity are more or less concord. So the majority of people may not know that they're cisgender, but most people who were assigned male at birth and then identify as men, those people will be identified as cisgender. And then we have transgender individuals, and those are individuals for whom sex and gender do not necessarily concord. And gender minority is another umbrella term that describes individuals who are transgender as well as intersex individuals. So those are individuals with a variation in sex characteristics at birth. Almost all the research that I'm going to be talking about today, I'll be talking more about transgender individuals. There's not a lot of research on dating violence among intersex individuals at this time, unfortunately. When we talk about gender identity, we can talk about it being binary or non-binary. So a binary an example of binary identity would be, for example, my identity, I'm a cisgender woman. And if I was a transgender woman, that would also be a binary identity. Non-binary identities are for individuals who feel like they are neither men nor women, may feel that there's some combination of men and male and female identities, feel that they may go back and forth, or have some third identity. There's a bunch of different ways of thinking about non-binary identities, and every person is going to have their own relationship with what that term means. One of the things that's always important to keep in mind is that gender minority individuals may have undergone or wish to undergo gender affirming medical treatments. So this would be hormonal treatments. This might be various kinds of physiological treatments in terms of changing their appearance in some way. But barring specific medical needs, so for example, if you are a physician who has concerns about how a medication may interact with an ongoing hormonal treatment or something very specific and medical, it's not necessary and can be considered quite rude to ask specific questions about a medical transition. So one of the things that's always important to highlight is that most frequently within a North American context, sexual and gender identity are different constructs. So sexual identity is your pattern of attraction to others, and gender identity is how you see yourself. So I'm going to be talking about both of these groups because they experience some overlap in terms of stigma and other things that we're going to talk about a little bit later. But it's important to keep in mind that there are many sexual minority individuals who are cisgender and many gender minority individuals who are heterosexual. So in terms of takeaways, it's really important to understand that adolescents are increasingly finding new ways to describe their gender identity and sexual identity, and that it's very normal for adolescents to change how they're thinking about these identities over time. So if you have a student and they identify as bisexual, and then they identify as queer, and then they identify as pansexual, that's very normal. These are, as you grow and evolve and experience the world and learn new things, these are very normal changes in terms of how youth identify. And this is something that I always have to keep in mind, is that my understanding of what a specific identity means may differ in terms of how another individual understands their identity. So if you're confused about what someone's identity, one of the things I always find with adolescents is that they really enjoy teaching you about their identities if you come to it with sort of an open and honest lack of knowledge. And it's always good to sort of make sure you're on the same page when someone tells you something about their identity. And asking about and using an individual's preferred pronouns and honoring their identities in other ways and not making assumptions about their sexual identity or gender identity are important ways of developing trust when we're thinking around these sorts of identity issues. So this gives us sort of a general vocabulary for talking about sexual and gender minority youth, and I'm going to use that throughout the rest of the presentation. So one of the things that is really important in terms of understanding why we would want to know about dating and sexual violence among gender and sexual minority youth is that a lot of youth report these kinds of identities. So even when we look at studies that are done with a very narrow range of possible identities, one of the things that we see is that between about 1% of youth will identify as gay or lesbian, between 1 and 11% identify as bisexual, about the same amount identify as mostly heterosexual, and a slightly smaller amount identify as uncertain. Similarly, about when we don't have a lot of great data on this, looking at this nationally within Canada, but certainly within the States, about 2% of adolescents report being transgender, and another 2% report being unsure as to whether they're transgender or not. And even more importantly, not only does this represent a huge percentage of youth, but we're seeing increases in the number of youth who are reporting having sexual minority identities. So, like I said, there's a significant and increasing number of youth with these kinds of identities, which makes understanding their experiences particularly important. So, in terms of the ecological context of sexual and gender minority youth, before we get into this sort of nitty-gritty about dating and sexual violence, I really wanted to talk about the kind of context that these youth live in and why this might be important for understanding their romantic relationships. So I like to think about some of the problems that this population experiences in terms of the idea of stigma. And a stigmatized identity is an identity that's devalued. And we know that individuals who experience stigmatized identities, and identities can be stigmatized for all sorts of reasons, experience worse treatment from other individuals as well as from institutions. And not only do they experience this worse treatment, but experiencing worse treatment over time, it can be internalized. And that process of internalizing stigma can also lead to poor self-concept and worse mental health. And while we know that the levels of stigma associated with sexual minority youth are changing, we still know that there's an important consequences of stigma experienced by sexual and gender minority youth. We know that they experience higher rates of victimization. We know they experience higher rates of parental rejection. They experience higher rates of homelessness, higher rates of child maltreatment and abuse, and greater likelihood of punishment by teachers and other educators when they're compared to heterosexual youth, or in the case of gender minority youth, cisgender youth. So we know that we can tell that these youth are experiencing stigma by the fact that they're more vulnerable to all of these sorts of interpersonal discriminatory experiences that are associated with stigma. And despite the fact that we have seen major improvements in terms of attitudes towards sexual and gender minority youth over the past several decades within Canada, we still know that the majority of both sexual and gender minority youth are experiencing transphobia and homophobia within the school environment. So as the social context, and then the final thing to keep in mind is that even though the overall environment is improving, one of the things that we're seeing is that youth are coming out at younger and younger ages. And while this is generally considered to be positive, this leads us to something that we call the developmental collision theory. And this is a really important theory as to understanding why, even though the environment is improving for sexual and gender minority youth, we're not seeing the mental health of these youth improve as much as we'd like. And this is essentially the idea that youth are coming out at earlier and earlier ages, so that youth are increasingly coming out as sexual or gender minorities during early adolescence. And we also know from all of the great work on peer relations that this is a particularly difficult time in terms of importance around things like conformity and following and being the same as everyone else, and teasing and bullying. So as youth come out at earlier ages, they are more likely to experience negative consequences compared to perhaps in earlier times when youth didn't feel as comfortable coming out. So even though we are seeing this improvement, this is still potentially a population that we need to think about specifically when we're talking about various kinds of violence outcomes. So just to summarize, the vulnerability that we associate with sexual and gender minority youth comes from stigma. And there are features of adolescence, so the importance of the peer context, for example, that make this period particularly challenging for youth with various kinds of stigmatized identities. And while social norms around sexual and gender minority status are improving, youth still face important barriers. So the next section is where we're going to move a little bit more into talking more specifically about dating violence. But before we talk about dating violence, I think it's really important to talk about romantic relationships as a context for resilience, because one of the things that you find when you talk to sexual minority youth and gender minority youth is that one of the best things about being a sexual and gender minority youth, according to these youth, is the kind of relationships that they get to engage in, getting to be with people that they really and truly love and who really see them. And especially when we talk about sexual minorities, romantic relationships define what it means to be a sexual minority adolescent. And in general, we know that social support is one of the most important protective factors for sexual and gender minority individuals. So having people you can count on is one of the things that is most protective when we think about these sorts of mental health outcomes. And for sexual and gender minority youth, romantic relationships are a really important source of social support. So we know that romantic relationships are protective for sexual minority youth and young adults. And we know that being in a relationship buffers against experiences of perceived rejection. And we also know that being in a romantic relationship can buffer against the consequences of family rejection. We also know that there's often a lot of positive consequences of being in romantic relationships for sexual and gender minority adolescents and emerging adults. We know that being in a romantic relationship is associated with lower levels of alcohol and drug use. It's associated with lower levels of distress, and it's associated with higher levels of self-esteem and lower levels of internalized homophobia. So in terms of supporting youth and thinking about a lot of the positive health outcomes that we want to see more of, romantic relationships do play an important role in protecting youth from a lot of these outcomes. And the other thing that's important to keep in mind is that romantic relationships for sexual minority youth are associated with a lot of the same things that are associated with positive romantic relationships among heterosexual and cisgender youth. So like romantic relationships for adolescents in general, romantic relationships for sexual and gender minority youth occur within a broader ecological context. Most of this research, by the way, has been done with sexual minority youth. So when it applies to both groups, I tend to specify. And if I just say sexual minority, it's not because I've forgotten gender minority youth. It's because the research just isn't where it would like to be to make these kinds of statements. So we know that things like parental acceptance, peer attachment, and social support are all associated with more positive romantic relationship quality among sexual minority youth. And these are some of the exact same mechanisms that are going to be associated with better romantic relationship quality among heterosexual youth as well. So just to summarize, a romantic relationship can be a really important source of support for sexual minority youth and young adults. Being in a relationship is associated with lower levels of many of the negative mental health behaviors that are sometimes associated with sexual and gender minority status, and it's associated with better mental health. And romantic relationships for sexual minority adults are shaped by their experiences in other relationships. So that paints a picture of why these relationships might be so important. But we also have to think about dating relationships for sexual minority youth as a potential context for risk. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind is we have to go back and think about, okay, what is the ecological context of sexual minority youth? And in terms of the higher levels of stigma and the higher levels of rejection and housing insecurity and et cetera. And we have to think that the impact of the ecological context of relationship quality has serious consequences for the romantic relationships of sexual and gender minority youth. So, and this is something that's going to be relevant in terms of thinking about how other groups that experience discrimination, such as racialized youth, such as youth with disabilities, are going to be experiencing dating violence. But we know that discrimination is associated with lower romantic relationship quality. And we also know that internalized stigma, and particularly internalized homophobia, is associated with lower relationship quality. And one of the things that we're particularly concerned about when we're talking about this lower relationship quality is dating violence. So dating violence is the perpetration or threat of an act of violence occurring within a romantic or dating relationship. There's a bunch of different subtypes of dating violence, such as psychological or emotional. So that's abuse around sort of feelings and demeaning someone. Verbal, that would be when the abuse takes place in terms of what two people say to each other. Physical, that's where physical contact is involved. And then sexual, that would be dating violence involving unwanted sexual contact. And while sexual and gender minority youth can experience those more general types of sexual dating violence, there are also more specific forms of sexual violence that are, of dating violence that we see in the relationships of sexual and gender minority youth. So this includes things like non-consensual disclosure of a partner's sexual or gender identity. So, for example, a partner threatening to out another partner as a gender minority or a sexual minority is a sort of gender or sexual minority specific kind of dating violence. Undermining or attacking a partner's sexual or gender identity. So saying that a partner saying that their partner isn't really gay if they won't engage in certain types of sexual activity, or telling a partner that they're not a real non-binary person. These would all be sort of sexual and gender minority specific forms of dating violence, and then isolating a partner from other members of the sexual or gender minority community. So we know that jealousy in general is part of sort of dating violence writ large, but more specific forms that you can sometimes see in the sexual or gender minority community is partners who really isolate their partner from, say, other lesbians or other gay men because they're worried that those people are going to hit on their partner. And I think one of the things that's really important is that we talk a lot about dating violence within for sexual minority youth, but it's quite probable that most, if not the majority of this dating violence doesn't happen in sort of same-sex relationships. A lot of it happens for individuals who have a sexual minority identity but are in a heterosexual relationship. So I always think that this is important to underline, just to clarify that it's not that these youth are just vulnerable because they're dating each other. They may be more vulnerable also when, say, a bisexual girl is dating a heterosexual boy. And one of the things that's quite upsetting is that we see pretty consistently that sexual minority youth report higher levels of dating violence sort of across the board. We see particularly high rates among youth who report both male and female partners, and we see higher levels particularly in individuals with bisexual identities. And in terms of understanding why we're seeing this higher level of vulnerability, there's been a lot of work trying to identify, well, why is it that sexual and gender minority youth are experiencing these higher levels of dating violence? And these explanations that have emerged from this literature are things like discrimination has been shown to account for a lot of this vulnerability, experiences of peer rejection and victimization. So returning to that, the whole idea of being treated poorly by your peers makes you more vulnerable, unfortunately, for being treated poorly in your romantic relationships, poor relationships with parents. So as much as positive relationships are associated with positive outcomes, negative relationships are associated with more negative outcomes. Youth who are living in situations of homelessness or housing insecurity are going to be experiencing more dating violence. And then internalized homophobia is also associated with higher levels of dating violence. We know that transgender adolescents also report significantly higher levels of dating violence than cisgender adolescents. And while there have been less studies looking specifically at the why of this, we know that when we talk about the ecological context for gender minority youth, we frequently see higher levels of many of the risk factors that we've seen in sexual minority youth. So higher levels of victimization, parental rejection, and homelessness. And this is all despite the fact that gender minority youth are less likely to report being in romantic relationships than cisgender youth. So just to sort of summarize, both sexual and gender minority youth are at an increased risk for dating violence, but this risk varies within sexual and gender minority populations. So for example, bisexual youth seem to report the highest levels of dating violence. And this elevated level of risk can be partially explained by a lot of the ecological factors we were talking about earlier, so experiences of discrimination and peer and family rejection. All right, so now we're going to shift the focus a little bit and talk about sexual violence and sexual and gender minority youth. So dating violence and sexual violence do overlap, but sexual violence is an umbrella term. I seem to use the term umbrella term a lot, that reflects a variety of different constructs. So one series of definitions that I find quite comprehensive, it suggests that sexual violence is made up of sexual harassment, unwanted sexual behavior, and sexual coercion. So sexual harassment is verbal and nonverbal behaviors that are sexual in nature and reflect hostile and degrading attitudes. Unwanted sexual behavior is a range of behaviors where the perpetrator attempts to or has unwanted sexual contact. And this includes sexual assault, but is not limited to sexual assault. And then finally, sexual coercion, which we talk a little bit less about when we're talking about adolescents, but that's when an individual feels extorted or incentivized into unwanted sexual activity. And in general, when we talk about sexual violence, there is that overlap with dating violence, particularly sexual dating violence. So sexual violence can occur within a dating relationship. And we generally see pretty consistently that there are higher levels of sexual violence among cisgender girls compared to cisgender boys. This has been posited to reflect the higher levels of sexualization around girls compared to boys. There's very little research on non-binary youth, specifically when it comes to this dynamic. But one of the things that we see is that across both sexual harassment and unwanted sexual contact, you see pretty consistently higher levels of sexual violence in transgender individuals compared to cisgender women and compared to cisgender men, and then among sexual minority men and women compared to heterosexual men. And you see this across a wide array of identities. In terms of digging into why you're seeing this difference, we just, with my colleague at the University of Sherbrooke, Geneviève Paquette, and Manon Bergeron at Université de Québec à Montréal, we just finished a qualitative study looking at sexual and gender minority individuals' descriptions of their sexual violence experience. And one of the things that's quite striking is that most of these sexual violence experiences look very much like your stereotypical sexual violence experience in which the individual reports a cisgender male as a perpetrator, and it occurs in some kind of social situation. And in terms of their descriptions, you see a lot of descriptions of feelings of sexualization and objectification, and it generally conforming with experiences of unwanted sexual attention among heterosexual and cisgender women. Another thing that's really interesting that we saw in terms of how individuals were describing their experiences is that a lot of individuals described homophobic or transphobic experiences as sexual violence, which when you think about it makes a lot of sense because a lot of homophobic and transphobic comments are going to be making reference to an individual's body or their sexual behavior. And those sorts of stereotypes are going to underlie a lot of homophobic and transphobic comments as well. So it is really important to understand that for a lot of sexual and gender minority youth, they may not be differentiating between sexual harassment and other forms of sexual violence and their homophobic and transphobic experiences. So just in terms of takeaways, we know that sexual and gender minority individuals may be more likely to report sexual violence because of their experiences of sexualization. We know that there's this overlap between transphobia and homophobia and certain types of sexual violence, as well as an overlap between dating violence as well as sexual violence. So the next thing I want to talk about is barriers to help seeking. And I think that it's fair to say that most adolescents experience a lot of barriers to help seeking in terms of when they're experiencing dating violence, but that I wanted to focus today on barriers that may be particularly pertinent for gender and sexual minority youth. I'm going to talk first about barriers to informal help seeking. So that would be talking to a friend, it might be talking to a parent. And these, when you ask sexual and gender minority youth, what kind of help seeking would you like after experiencing dating violence? They're much more likely to report wanting informal help, which I think is something that you see within the population among adolescents in general. Some of these barriers that may impede this are internalized homophobia and transphobia. So unfortunately, some youth are going to feel like they deserve bad treatment within their relationship because they're a sexual or gender minority, and they may not feel like they can do any better, which is really sad. We also know that these youth tend to have smaller social networks, so there may be fewer people that they can go to. There's also concerns about greater reliance on partners for social support. So if a sexual or gender minority youth is experiencing rejection from their family, they may be more dependent on their partner than a youth who's not experiencing rejection from their family, and so may feel like they don't want to rock the boat or change their housing situation or financial situation in ways that might be really important. There's also concerns that you see a lot about fears about reinforcing negative stereotypes about sexual and gender minority communities. Dismissive attitudes towards intimate partner violence within sexual minority communities, and the close-knit nature of sexual and gender minority communities, where the youth may not feel like they can communicate without really putting their partner's reputation at risk. In terms of barriers to more formal help seeking, there's feelings about resources that are poorly adapted. The fact that service providers will often minimize the likelihood that, for example, two women can engage in dating violence. It's unfortunately a common attitude that you see among certain service providers. Negative attitudes, so homophobia and transphobia by service providers, and then more specifically, lack of shelter options for gender and some sexual minority individuals. In terms of the kinds of services that individuals want, one of the things that we see is that there's very few sexual and gender minority youth who report dating violence, report help seeking. So the minority reported any kind of help seeking at all. And youth, as was the case with youth in general, like I said, they're much more comfortable with sort of these informal mechanisms than more formal mechanisms. So beyond barriers to help seeking that youth face in general, we can imagine that sexual and gender minority youth might be facing additional barriers in terms of thinking about help seeking. And we know that most sexual and gender minority youth will not seek help in the face of their dating violence. So I wanted to wrap up today just by talking a little bit about some recommendations for educators. And I really grouped these into three sort of bins. The first are things to know, the second are things to say, and the third are things to do. And I think if you walk away from this I don't want to say that. One of the things I'd really like you to walk away from this presentation with is the idea that the importance of recognizing the potential vulnerability for dating and sexual violence among sexual and gender minority adolescents. So it's really important to avoid gender-based stereotypes around dating violence, victimization, and perpetration. We often have very sort of traditional and stereotyped understanding of who's victimized by dating violence and who's perpetrating dating violence. And if the more that we let go of those ideas, the more we can actually see the youth who need help, because even though they fall outside of these stereotypes. And it's also important to think about, well, when you see a youth who's experiencing dating violence or who seems at risk for experiencing dating violence, what are the ecological factors that may make them more vulnerable? So things like, are they being victimized by peers? Are they experiencing housing instability? These are things to sort of keep in mind when you're trying to think about, well, is a youth going to be more vulnerable to dating violence? Of course, we should always underscore the fact that these are just risk factors. There will be youth who experience all of these risk factors who will have the most resilient and the most positive romantic relationship that you can imagine. And there will, of course, be youth who are experiencing none of these risk factors and who are experiencing pretty serious dating violence. So whenever we're thinking about risk factors, we always have to think about risk, not cause. The next thing that I wanted to highlight is the importance of not just thinking about these relationships as a context for risk. So I really want to highlight how important these relationships, romantic relationships, can be to sexual and gender minority youth in terms of giving them the support and the additional support that they need. And then finally, I think the last thing that in terms of thinking about this is that it's really I think you see a lot less of this than you used to, but you used to see a lot of really negative stereotypes about the kinds of relationships that sexual and gender minority people could have. Just ideas that these relationships tended not to function very well, and it was sort of part of some of the really terrible stigma you used to see around sexual and gender minority individuals. And I think that it's really important to understand this risk for dating violence among sexual and gender minority youth as being related to this larger picture around peer rejection and around particularly family rejection that we know is so important for predicting their outcomes. Finally, it's important to keep in mind that dating violence and sexual violence are both similar and different for sexual and gender minority youth. So one really great resource is Love is Respect, which are resources for sexual and gender minority youth. And it provides some guidelines about healthy boundaries within relationships for these youth. So for example, things like a healthy relationship involves someone who uses your chosen gender pronouns or name, someone who respects your boundaries, someone who gives you space to hang out with your friends without thinking that you're cheating, someone who doesn't take your money or tell you what to buy, someone who never threatens to out you to people, and someone who never tells you that you're not a real lesbian, gay man, trans person, or whatever your identity is because you don't have sex the way that they want you to. So these are all really important and specific messages that are for sexual and gender minority youth that they may not be hearing in these sort of more general interventions around dating violence. In terms of things to communicate, and I hope I communicated this well today. I've been studying this for a long time, but I still think that I have a lot to learn from adolescents about sexual and gender minority issues. So these are always evolving ideas. Identities are always evolving. The experiences youth are having always are evolving. And if there's one thing I've learned is that you may be better at this than I am, but I certainly can't trick adolescents into thinking that I know more than I say that I know, or that I know more than I actually know. I think it's important to let adolescents clarify how they define their sexual or gender identities. It's really important to avoid gendered language when discussing dating or sexual violence. So some of the feedback that I've gotten from a lot of sexual and gender minority youth is as soon as they see someone talking about dating violence and it's a boyfriend hitting a girlfriend or a girlfriend screaming at a boyfriend or what have you, they just sort of turn off because they feel like this isn't information for them. And these are people who don't understand my reality at all. And again, when working with gender or sexual minority young youth or young adults, it's really important to try to avoid assumptions about what kinds of relationships they have based on the labels that they use. So the fewer assumptions you have, the fewer assumptions you can be wrong about. In terms of things to do, it's important to be mindful of sexual and gender minorities' experiences. So try to avoid dated stereotypes around gender and sex, sex and gender roles when you're talking about romantic relationships. It's important to choose materials and programming that address sexual and gender minority, that address dating violence that are inclusive, or modifying existing programming to be more inclusive. And for example, I think the Safe Dates program now has a lot of language around, has been modified for sexual and gender minority individuals. Use visible symbols like pride flags to indicate that a space is inclusive for sexual and gender minority students, and include sample examples of sexual and gender minority youth when discussing issues such as consent and dating violence. So those are, so just to conclude, romantic relationships are an important developmental milestone. These relationships are contexts of risk and resilience. We know that sexual and gender minority youth experience specific barriers for service usage, but that supportive relationships with adults in the school environment are an extremely important source of support for sexual and gender minority youth. So thank you very much for your time today, and I'd love to take any questions.
Well, thank you. That was a lot of information, and I really appreciate sort of how you really integrated the science with the practice and thinking about what are the issues that many of our people who are listening on the web today have to deal with on a regular basis. We have a couple of really interesting questions that's come up, so I'm going to share with you.
Can I turn off share screen?
Sure.
Do I know how to do that?
Or not.
Oh, I do. Sorry. Got it. Perfect. All right.
Okay, so one of the questions that came up is you were talking a lot about what are the barriers that people have seeking help. Do you have any suggestions about and how that the resources aren't really adapted well? Do you have any
so I think
about how to adapt those resources?
So I think that like there's many different levels of adapting resources. So I think that probably at the most basic level, one of the most important things to do is to just emphasize to sexual and gender minority youth that this is a program that has thought about them, or at least if you're administering this program, you have thought about them. So as much as you can in terms of adapting resources, the more you can make language gender neutral, the easier it's going to be. And this is actually quite, I think we tend to have this stereotype that boys are more likely to perpetrate dating violence and girls are more likely to be victims of dating violence. That is also not that supported in the literature. So the more you can use information or language like partner or date, or you may be more creative than me, but partner and date both seem to capture the same idea, where you're just not mentioning gender at all and just use that sort of whenever you're talking about, did your date say this versus did your boyfriend or girlfriend say this? Right. This just opens it up for people who may have partners who are boys or girls or neither boys nor girls. And that's just going to help on a deeper level. I think that also including information about including resources that are more specifically geared for sexual and gender minority youth. So some of these LGBTQ specific hotlines, when you're providing information about who to talk to, is really important in terms of like letting youth know that they're being seen in terms of the specific needs that they might be dealing with. So those would be my first two big steps. And then more broadly, any of the things that you can do to suggest that it's a supportive environment for sexual and gender minority youth. So pride flags, GSA stuff, anything like that it can be really quite helpful.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Another interesting question was sort of that you used the term gender and sexual minority as an umbrella term. And there's a question about has research been done to look at the level of comfort or acceptance that the youth that are covered under that term might feel about that term?
So that's a really good question. And I use the term sexual and gender minority, or increasingly you're also seeing minoritized, which sort of centers youth within systems of oppression. So a lot of people will use those two terms sort of a little bit interchangeably. You're seeing more movement towards minoritized. But generally, I think it's like a lot of things. You want to use the label that the youth is using most specifically, but I tend to use sexual and gender minority more than LGBTQ because there are so many different kinds of identities that when you just go with LGB or LGBT or LGBTQ, and then after that it gets a little bit long. So whenever I'm giving presentations, I tend to use the term sexual minority, but if you have a student who wants you to use LGBTQ or some other term, I would switch to what they're using because they're going to be better at informing you what adolescents like to hear than I am, unfortunately.
So ask them is the quick, ask them what's the term and no research on that you know of?
No.
Yeah, okay. Well, that was all the questions that we had.
One of the things that I realized that I got a little antsy about the time is that, where did you all go? Is that I had a little bit more information on resources. Would you like me to go over those a little bit more slowly?
I think that would be great. I think everybody would appreciate that. So please.
All right, perfect. So let me go back to
share again, though, in public. You're going to have to share your screen. You good with that?
I am very good with that. All right. Share. There we go. So just in terms of some additional resources, I find that the website Love is Respect is really good. And so this is a website that provides a lot of really great information and support about dating and sexual violence among sexual and gender minority individuals. So this is it provides great information about healthy relationships in general, but I I find the way that they talk about sexual and gender minority youth in particular, and the specific kinds of issues that they might be experiencing are particularly useful. Similarly, VAWNet provides important information for about dating and sexual violence among sexual and gender minority individuals, but it also provides some resources for service providers as well. So if you're a service provider, including an educator, this would be a source that you could go to for that kind of more specific information about sort of adapting services and things like that. And then one of the probably the best resources, I think, for educators in terms of talking about sexual and gender minority youth is GLSEN. And so this is just GLSEN is an organization that for a bunch of years has been doing some really groundbreaking work on supporting educators and supporting sexual and gender minority adolescents in the school environment specifically. There's also GSA Network, which is a website for developing they used to be called gay straight alliances. Now, increasingly, they're called gender and sexuality alliances within a school. And then there's also Youth Line, which is a place where LGBT youth can call for support. So this is more of a general support line, but they are also capable of dealing with sort of gender and sexual and dating violence issues in particular.
Great, thank you for that. Wondering, this question about if you know of any French resources.
French resources, that is a really good question that I do have some specific Quebec specific resources, and I will add those to the PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, that would be great. Someone in the audience has written Interling in Quebec.
Yeah, Interling is a really great, that would be one example. I just blanked on the name of every French resource I've ever known about.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions from the audience? Well, we still have a bit of time, so we're happy to take them. Or you could be thinking, I'm going to get my lunch, so just giving them a minute. Because if they're like me, it takes a while to type.
My colleagues all talk about the importance of giving everyone a little bit of extra time when responding to something over Zoom.
Yeah.
Just the processing time takes a little bit longer with the screen, I find.
Yeah, combine that with my age and it's not pretty. No. We have a question about, are there any upcoming research?
Oh, wow. Yeah, there's a ton. So I'm part of a larger project that Wendy is organizing, where we're going to specifically be really digging into dating violence during COVID and focusing particularly on how sexual and gender minority youth are faring in terms of their relationship quality during COVID. So we're going to really be able to dig into how this pandemic is affecting experiences of dating violence and the kind of resources that youth need during what is hopefully not going to be too much longer, but is a continuing situation that we're all living in.
Okay, another question is, do you have recommendations for working with limitations of school settings? For example, you may not be able to show the pride flag.
That is a really good question. I think those are going to be really specific questions depending on the kinds of limitations that one is working with. I think if, for example, I can't imagine a context in which you can not show a pride flag but could start a GSA. But I also think that if you have, it's essentially the same thing that you would do if you had any student who looked like they were in trouble, is that you would want to be able to reach out to them, not necessarily informing them that you think that they may be experiencing dating violence or that they may be experiencing different treatment because of their real or perceived sexual identity or gender identity. But just, I think that if you're in a situation in which you're really limited in terms of your ability to broadcast that publicly, broadcasting it privately to students, just in terms of telling them that they can really turn to you to support for anything, would probably be your best option.
One of our participants here has noted that there are already increased reports of sexual violence and exploitation in the pandemic, which is very concerning. We know that with adults. Is there any research out yet with adolescents or with gender minority youth?
I have not seen, I haven't seen published research, but I know that there's a number of research groups that are working on getting that information out. And then the next step is going to be, I think, and it's going to be the same thing for everyone looking at adolescents across the board, is what do we do to help youth who just experienced this really difficult period recover? And so I know a couple of groups are going to be developing information around that.
And I think it's really important when you think about these youth might be living in environments where they have that parental rejection or all those other ecological factors that you were referring to.
Yeah. So I think, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I just think that we're particularly worried about for sexual. We don't always think of school as being the most safe place for sexual and gender minority youth, but for many sexual and gender minority youth who are experiencing a rejection or worse at home, it may be their safer place. So this is going to, I think all educators right now are feel that are a little bit, the feedback I'm getting from a lot of educators right now is just the nervousness of what happens when everyone comes back into the classroom and things sort of return to normal. But I think that is particularly the case for sexual and gender minority youth.
Yeah, and the other interesting piece is when you think about it, for like youth, that's where they go for their informal sources of support, right?
Yeah.
So even though school may not be a context that feels totally safe, it's actually an space for support.
Yeah, it's where a lot of their friends are.
Okay, there's lots of information here. So in the chat box, people are referring to cybertip.ca, and they report that nationally online sexual exploitation has increased since the beginning of COVID. Saw an 81% spike over April, May, and June in reports from youth who had been sexually exploited, and reports of people trying to sexually abuse children. And they put some references in there. They've also reported that the Alberta Internet Child Exploitation Unit has received 243 reports of exploitation in March, and more than double the 2-month average. They also report that between March and mid-July, Manitoba RCMP opened 113 internet child exploitation investigations, a 20% increase. So there's some work on child exploitation and those issues, but clearly we really do need to be concerned about children and experiences are.
Yeah, those are really scary statistics, and it's going to be a lot of work for a lot of people.
So I just want to thank you for taking the time today. It was so valuable. I really appreciated the time you took at the beginning to review of the terms and sort of help us all understand. And I think it is challenging for us who are not youth and who are not living in this world to understand. And the more that we can educate ourselves and learn about some of the things like the differences between these youth and as well as their experiences and how they want to be called and respectfully engage with them, I think that's really important. So I thank you for bringing science to us today and the research and increasing our understanding. And you've also brought a lot of tips that we can take into our daily practice and our daily lives to make the world a safer and more respectful and kinder and compassionate place. So thank you.
That's very kind, and I really enjoyed everyone's comments and questions today, and it was a real pleasure to be able to speak with you all.
Okay, and I remind you that Stacy has put the link to our evaluation, so please complete the evaluation and get your certificate of attendance. And thank you for joining us as a great audience, a really great input in the chat box, and we always appreciate that. And please come back. We're trying to put on at least one webinar a month. And thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Take care, everyone, and be safe. Bye.
Hi, Stacy.